guys. I'm going to try to record another video. Took a bit of a break. I've been feeling really under the weather, and I tried to record this a couple weeks back and realized the hard way that my phone only takes in about an hour and then it stops. So I'm going to go through my monster movies, about half of them, and I'm going to stop after I get through the Toho films. So I'm just doing my stop motion animated films and then my Toho films, and I'm going to go through each of them. Um, Starting with this wonderful tin I have here of the original King Kong. This is one of my favorite films. This is a beautiful tin. Unfortunately, I am going to have to upgrade this because in about the mid 2000s, around 2005, Warner Brothers was putting out these kind of faulty DVDs that are actually starting to degrade now. I'm starting to see a lot of Warner Brothers titles from this time degrading. Um, Fortunately, King Kong still works. It's only the special features that don't work, but it's only a matter of time. And this isn't like my favorite movie. It's not even in my top 10 favorite films. It's one of my favorites, but I have a lot of favorites, but it's not up there. However, this is a movie that I probably watch more than any other movie. It is in my top 50, maybe top 25 favorite movies, but I watch this movie all the time. It's one of those like five movies that I can pretty much put in anytime and I never get tired of it. So I guess it is one of my favorite films, but there's something really, really magical about the original King Kong that has never been replicated by any of the remakes or any of the cameos that he's had in other movies or the team ups that he's had with Godzilla. You know, none of them have ever captured the magic of this movie. The original King Kong was filmed during a time when the world was a much simpler place, and there's something kind of enchanting about that and mysterious about that in modern times you really can't capture that sense of whimsy and magic, you know, about a world where the whole world hadn't been discovered yet. There could be this mythical island, you know, and the fact that it came out of the Great Depression, you know, from a time of our great sadness and great sorrow came this magical film that transported audiences to the world of Skull Island and to introduce them to the notion of a lost world where dinosaurs could exist and a giant ape could exist and a giant ape can fall in love with a woman and essentially die because of her. um, the other thing that always bothered me about the remakes is they try too hard to make Kong sympathetic. What makes Kong so sad is the fact that he is a beast, you know. I mean, he eats people, he crushes people. He loves this woman. She's terrified of him, and I find the fact that she is terrified of him to be a lot more effective. He dies for her, and she doesn't return his feelings, and there's something very sad about that, you know. And I find that the remakes try too hard to make Kong like this likable character when he already was, you know. I mean, if you're human, you automatically feel for him. And I just feel like the remakes have always gone too overboard with that, trying to humanize Kong a little bit. And then King Kong versus Godzilla, you know, I'm not a huge fan of. There's some behind the scenes drama with Willis O'Brien and Toho that never really set well with me. I feel like Willis O'Brien was really given the short end of the stick over the years after this, you know. He pioneered this technology and he brought us this wonderful film, and I feel like he didn't, like in his later career, didn't get the respect that he deserved, and something about that just really doesn't set well with me. Makes me really sad, which is one reason why, and I'll talk about it a little later when I get to King Kong versus Godzilla, but why that movie will never set well with me. One of many reasons. But anyway, the original King Kong is just a wonderful film. I love the background plates in this movie. It has the feeling of a black and white Gustave Doré ink drawing. You know, the fact that there are all these layers to Skull Island. done through miniatures and matte paintings and paintings on panes of glass, layer by layer, and they built it up. And there's something just so otherworldly and beautiful about it. And there's no recapturing that atmosphere. It is just one of the most gorgeous films of the 1930s. There's a lot of personality in it, and I could talk about King Kong forever. It's a classic movie. Everybody's seen it, hopefully. There are also some wonderful dinosaurs in it. It's just, this movie is one of the most charming films ever made. I don't think you'll ever find a more charming monster movie than King Kong. Next up is Son of Kong, which is a film that's not so charming. I don't hate it, but it definitely feels like a movie that was made in the same year. Very rushed, very cheap. I like Robert Armstrong a lot. It's nice seeing him as Carl Denham again, and I kind of like the stuff I find more interesting about this movie is the backlash from Kong and how he's being held responsible for all of the things that King Kong did to New York. That's the more interesting stuff in this movie, but once he gets to Skull Island and it's just kind of a repeat of King Kong minus the Sol, it's just not as good. I don't hate it. I can watch it, but it's nowhere near as on the level of the original King Kong. But I don't hate it. It's a fun, like if you have a rainy Sunday afternoon and you want a giant ape movie, you could do a lot worse. I'm going to put it down because it will fall. Next up is a movie that is as charming as the original King Kong. This is Mighty Joe Young. It carries on some certain themes and ideas from King Kong and mixes it with kind of the Western sensibilities of John Ford, who is a producer on this film. Marion C. Cooper comes back from King Kong. This is a very, very heartwarming movie. This is probably the movie that made me kind of fall in love with gorillas and why they're one of my favorite animals ever. This movie makes me cry. Even though it does have a happy ending, it still gets me. And it's so good. And it's kind of a shame, Willis O'Brien was training Ray Harryhausen on this. This was Harryhausen's first film, and Harryhausen would become his replacement. So there's something kind of bittersweet about that. But at the same time, there are few animators in the history of animation that are able to capture the personality and warmth of a creature quite like him. No matter what kind of monster he was doing, there was always a kind of personality to them where you felt that they weren't just monsters, they were living creatures, and that's something that he brought to them that very few people bring to their monsters, and you don't really see that a lot in monsters today in the CGI films. They feel very cold and very sterile a lot of the time. But Ray Harryhausen really was the master at doing that, and Mighty Joe Young is just a beautiful, beautiful movie, and Terry Moore is really good in it. She's very likable. She's as likable as Mighty Joe and just as kind of naive and used as he is. And you feel really bad for her. Very sympathetic lead in this movie. But yeah, this is just a classic. It didn't do very well when it was first released, but has since become pretty beloved. It was remade. The remake, I'm not overly fond of. It just feels very Disney and hokey, and I don't know, just doesn't do it for me. But the original Mighty Joe Young is just a wonderful, wonderful movie. Joe. Next up is the Sinbad Collection. These are the 3 Ray Harryhausen films that he did. These are probably, I don't know, if I had to pick like films that really defined Ray Harryhausen, these would probably be them, or at least these first 2. I just really love the fantasy movies that he did, but if I had to pick one, it would be really hard. It would be somewhere between The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and The Golden Voyage of Sinbad. I like the monsters in The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad more. The Cyclops in this movie is one of the most iconic stop motion creatures ever, probably second only to King Kong. Just a really, really cool, unique take on a Cyclops, and I really appreciate that it's not just a guy with one eye. It's a monster with goat legs and a horn, and he's just really neat. And I like the dragon a lot. It also introduced us to the skeleton, which is something that Ray Harryhausen would return to later. I like the characters in this. I really like the villain, Sakura. He's a lot of fun. The score by Bernard Herrmann is fantastic. It really brings to mind Saint Saëns' Samson and Delilah suite. Kind of reminds me of that, but I love it. One of the great adventure scores of all time. However, the Golden Voyage of Sinbad, I may prefer the cast to this one. I like Kerwin Matthews as Sinbad and Catherine Grant, but something about them just feels like typical 1950s leads, whereas Golden Voyage of Sinbad has kind of a sexiness to it, which it was made in the 70s, so of course it did. But I really, really like John Philip Law in as Sinbad. He's my favorite Sinbad. I like the turban that he wears, his beard. There's something more exotic about him. And then Carolyn Monroe in the lead. I mean, it's Carolyn Monroe, so you can't beat that. The monsters aren't as great, but I like the characters. The villain is played by Doctor Who, Tom Baker himself, and he's awesome. But the greatest stop-motion creature in this is probably Kali. I really like the sword fight with Kali and her multiple arms just moving, and it's a really, really cool visual. Sinbad in the Eye of the Tiger is okay. It's not one I return to very often. There are things I like about it because the stop motion is really cool, but it just doesn't have quite the personality of the first two. But I like it. They're all good. Next up is Jason and the Argonauts. This is another classic fantasy movie. This one probably has the best story of all the fantasy movies. It feels more rooted in Greek mythology, and is taken as it's more of a direct adaptation of Greek mythology, whereas later on, Clash of the Titans would take a lot of liberty with the Greek myths. The acting in it is really good. This is just a really great epic that feels a lot more expensive than it actually was. It feels very big. The Hydra is one of Harryhausen's coolest monsters. I really like his attention to detail and how he was able to give life to this thing that has multiple heads, and to give a performance to something that is also moving around like that just seems like such an impossibility, but that's part of the magic of Ray Harryhausen. I have Hedora the Smog Monster here, who I'm going to move. A little cameo by him. Next up is H.G. Wells' First Men in the Moon. This is just a really, really great science fiction movie. I would compare it more to things like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The monsters really aren't the focus of it. It's just a damn good science fiction movie. It stars Lionel Jeffries, who is just a ton of fun in this. And Harryhausen movies don't get enough credit for their actors. People only go to them for the monsters, but this is one of the ones that it's just a good movie. It's just a damn good science fiction movie. The Ray Harryhausen aspect of it is almost secondary. This is just a really good adaptation of H.G. Wells. If you guys haven't seen it, Victorian era science fiction is always really cool, and it keeps it in that time setting. Speaking of which, there's also The Mysterious Island, based on Jules Verne. If you really like Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I feel like this is a great follow-up to it. Kind of has similar vibes. Captain Nemo makes a return, spoiler alert, but there's a change from the source material in which Harryhausen adds monsters on the island, but I thought it was really appropriate and really kind of tied it into 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea a little bit, but really cool survival movie on an island based on a classic novel. Next up is It Came from Beneath the Sea. I've only seen this one once. It's kind of a standard 1950s monster on the loose film, but I like it. I mean, the octopus is pretty neat. He doesn't have as much personality as a lot of the monsters. I think that's why I've never really returned to this one. But I do like it. I mean, I generally like 50s monster movies. It's nowhere near as good as this one. Of his Monster on the Loose films, I feel like this is probably the best one. 20 Million Miles to Earth is almost like his alien remake of King Kong set in Rome. The emir is a very sympathetic creature. We automatically feel for it because we see the poor little thing hatching out of an egg, and it's kind of adorable, and he's completely innocent. All he wants to do is eat sulfur, and people just won't leave him alone. They keep stabbing at him and poking at him and trying to kill him for no reason. This thing has never done anything to hurt anybody, and they just have to keep messing with him. And you really feel bad for him. But of the Monster on the Loose type films that he did, this is probably my favorite one. The Emir is just such a neat monster, and unfortunately, he no longer survives because he became the Cyclops from Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. You can tell by his posture, the amount of toes and fingers he has. He became the Cyclops, which is kind of neat. But what a great monster. Really like him. Next up is Earth versus the Flying Saucers. I find that Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich really steal from Harryhausen a lot because Earth vs. the Flying Saucers is basically the original Independence Day, except nowhere near as pandering and terrible as that movie. I don't mean to offend anybody, but I've never really gotten the appeal of Independence Day. I think it's an awful movie. But Earth vs. the Flying Saucers is a lot of fun. Again, it's not really traditional Harryhausen. There's not a lot of monsters in it, but the flying saucers are kind of neat, and he does what he can to instill personality into them, the way they pivot and fly around and stuff. But this is kind of a typical 1950s science fiction film, but it's elevated by the special effects. But really fun. And speaking of Roland Emmerich, his remake of Godzilla is pretty much a remake of this, only again without the personality. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is really a ton of fun. Ray Harryhausen's first solo effort. The Radosaurus he has a lot of personality. Ray Harryhausen always said the way that he liked to envision his creatures is, what would they be like if they weren't rampaging? What are they like if they're sleeping or just resting? That's how he would try to envision that. And you really get that feeling from the Radosaurus that this is just an animal. He's not a monster. He doesn't mean any, ill will per se, even though he does eat a cop at one point. But who hasn't? But you do get the sense that this is just an animal. He's not a monster. He's just some poor animal who woke up. Is very loosely based on Ray Bradbury's The Foghorn, although the only thing it really has in common with that is there is a scene with a lighthouse in it. The Foghorn by Ray Harryhausen is a very sad, beautiful little short story that you guys should read. But it inspired a great movie monster, which inspired another great movie monster, because it's arguable that Godzilla would not be around without the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. But yeah, I'm going to be saying it has a lot of personality a lot with these Ray Harryhausen movies. Next up is The Valley of Gwangi. This is an awesome movie. It really delivers on its premise of mixing cowboys and dinosaurs. Gwangi, the dinosaur, is awesome. This is another one that's pretty much a remake of King Kong. This is like they took King Kong and put it in the Wild West, which, come on, it's just awesome. It takes a little while for them to get to Gwangi, but I like the characters, and it's goofy and it's fun, but the wait is well worth it, because when they get to the titular Valley of Gwangi and they meet Gwangi, it's, man, it is glorious. What a great dinosaur. Probably my favorite dinosaur that's ever been on screen. He just has a ton of personality, and even though he is a beast, you still feel sorry for him when he comes to his ultimate demise. No no creature deserves to die that way. I won't spoil it, but he doesn't meet a very happy ending, and it's no animal deserves to die that way. And that's the thing about Ray Harryhausen's movies is you don't think of these, like I said, you don't think of these creatures as monsters. You think of them as they're animals, and they don't deserve to be treated a certain way. So you automatically empathize with them no matter how horrible they are. And Guanji is horrible. Make no mistakes about that. He is a monster. He is a beast. But what a wonderful beast he is. And there's a really great fight scene with a Styracosaurus. And the Western scenes really work. There's an adorable little prehistoric horse in it. Yeah, it's awesome. And then next up is this is actually a Willis O'Brien movie. I should probably switch these two. But The Black Scorpion, this one gets a bit of a bad rap because it was on Mystery Science Theater, and it is kind of a run-of-the-mill giant monster movie, but it is a lot of fun. Again, I can't dislike any movie with a giant monster on the loose and stop motion animation. And I like the big bugs, and the Black Scorpion's really cool. And the idea of a giant scorpion is so unique. And to my knowledge, I don't think it's ever really been done after this, unless you count the smaller ones that are in Clash of the Titans. But the idea of a giant scorpion is just cool. So my love of this movie doesn't really go much deeper than that. Sometimes it doesn't. I like my really deep art films, but sometimes it's just as simple as having a big black scorpion in a movie. That'll float my boat. Next up is Clash of the Titans. This movie has been done to death. Everybody loves this movie. Everybody loves this movie. Not more I can really add to it. Medusa is terrifying. I have a very early experience with this movie that was traumatizing to me. I saw it on Christmas Day when I was like 8 years old with my uncle had it on. And I only saw the scenes with Medusa. I wouldn't see the rest of the movie until years later, but the scenes with Medusa were burned into my head forever. And I don't think there's ever been an instance of a stop motion creature being as terrifying as Medusa is in this movie. She is just chilling. And the thing that like makes her so cool is all previous versions of Medusa had always been like people, usually a man. In the case of the Seven Phases of Dr. Lowe, it was Tony Randall played her, but usually a man or a woman, with snakes in the hair and painted. This was a beast, a thing that crawled around on her belly and had a tail and slithered and had a rattle and warty skin and pointy ears and just and then that magic glow in her eyes when you would see her, and the fact that there was no avoiding her because he gave her a bow and arrow, so if you weren't looking at her, she'll make you look at her. Yeah, just terrifying creature. But I like the Kraken a lot. He's cute. He has kind of a similar vibe to the Ymir in a way. Pegasus is really neat. Unfortunately, a lot of the effects budget went to the cast. This movie has an amazing cast. Everybody is in this movie, and but I feel like the cast, that money should have went to the special effects. And this movie really is an end of an era because with movies like Star Wars and whatnot, Ray Harryhausen couldn't do his thing anymore, and it's part of the reasons why I have this love-hate relationship with Star Wars. It's that it changed film forever, for better or worse. On the one hand, it did open the door for some really amazing fantasy movies that followed, and including this one. I feel like it did make this movie kind of possible, but it also kind of destroyed a lot of really great special things that were maybe going on the wane anyway, but it's just, I don't know, when you think about the Ray Harryhausen movies and the Godzilla movies at the time and the Hammer movies, all that stuff kind of went away a little bit because of that. But that's just what happens, I guess. Film is in trends. But next up is The Giant Behemoth. This was another attempt by Willis O'Brien to kind of stay afloat. His time had kind of come, and he wasn't getting the type of work. And this was kind of his response to The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. It's Not as charming as the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, but it doesn't deserve the kind of ridicule it gets either. It's a standard giant monster movie, and at the end of the day, I'll take a stop motion creature over pretty much anything else. Man in suit, puppet. I'll take stop motion over any of that. So even though this movie isn't as regarded as the Harryhausen films, I don't know. I'll still take it. It's fun. Next up is The Lost World. This is probably my favorite science fiction horror genre film of the silent era. Really cool dinosaur movie. And again, this one has a magic to it that would later be seen with like King Kong. As far as creating that image of a lost world that feels very timeless. The Lost World itself would be revisited in Pixar's Up. They took the look of the South American jungle plateau from this film, actually. Dinosaurs are really great, but the big standout for me as a monster movie lover is I love that it's a brontosaurus, which I'll call a brontosaurus. Yes, I know that's not the proper nomenclature now, but at the time it was, and as a fantasy creature, I refer to it as a brontosaurus. I like that they take the brontosaurus back, and it runs amok in London. The last 15 minutes of this movie are so great because it's just this dinosaur biting at lamps, and and I appreciate any time it's a plant-eating dinosaur on the loose, because so often it's always a meat eater. How often do you get like a big brontosaurus running around terrorizing people? So it's great. Wilson Bryan would, of course, return to brontosauruses in King Kong. There's the vicious brontosaurus in King Kong. So I always feel like that was like his little nod, maybe, to The Lost World. But really cool movie. All right, now I only have a half hour to do my Godzilla movies. I think I can do it if I just move really quickly. The original Godzilla, what's more to say about this movie? This one's been talked about a lot. There's the Criterion edition. I still haven't gotten the Criterion box set. I'm not really fond of the cover to it, and I don't like those slipcases where you actually have to touch the disc to get them out. So I might not get that one. I'll get around to it eventually, I'm sure, but I had to think about it. But the original Godzilla is just a masterpiece of Japanese cinema. It's such a great commentary on the Bikini Atoll testing and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, and not just that, but the fallout from that, and the American occupation post-war, and the changes, almost the westernization of Japan after. A lot of social commentary in this movie that really elevates it above your average monster movie. This is just a masterpiece. It's tragic. Some genuinely chilling things in this movie that just recall like the horrors of war. This is probably the ultimate anti-war science fiction movie, or at least among them. Yeah, really scary, genuinely unsettling. This is the only Godzilla movie that I would probably call a horror movie. But yeah, speaking of Godzilla, I have Godzilla right here, and I'm going to toss him to the side. All right, next up is Godzilla Raids again. This one kind of it kind of reminds me of Son of Kong because it was rushed out really, really quickly. It follows some similar beats to the original movie, but it just lacks the power and the sense of urgency that the original one has. It's really only notable because it stars Anguirus or Anguirus or Anzilla, whichever version you're watching of this movie. We'll call him a different thing. And he's been called different things anyway, but that's the spiny little fellow there. Cute, wonderful monster. But other than that, it's really not notable. I'm not a tremendous fan of it. I'm going to skip King Kong versus Godzilla because I have all my Godzilla movies ordered by what company put them out. So we're going to Godzilla number 4, which is Mothra versus Godzilla. This is my favorite or my second favorite of the Showa era, depending on what kind of mood I'm in. I really like this one because it takes the atomic horrors of the first one and it kind of brings them back. This movie is very socially conscious. It's one of the last films to really do that in the series because it does bring Godzilla back as a instrument of nuclear horror, and it does explain that Mothra's island has been bombed too. So it does have that aspect from the original Godzilla movie, but it's also important for kind of bringing Mothra into the mix and kind of starting to establish Toho as a shared movie universe. That all these monsters exist together. The Peanuts return as the Shinobi Jin, the two little twin fairies who I adore. Some of the music in this movie, particularly the Sacred Springs by Akira Ifukube, just really haunting stuff. It is just beautiful. This is one of the more whimsical Godzilla movies. I really, really like the Godzilla suit in this. I like the little, like, kind of yellowish eyebrows that he has, and the blue eyes, and kind of the splayed fingers that he has. Really great Godzilla suit. Maybe my favorite of the Showa era, but these old Godzilla suits just have a lot of personality to them. And then Mothra is always great, but really cool movie. Next up is Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster. This one came out the same year as the previous one, and again, it further establishes the Godzilla canon and the Toho universe. Ghidorah is a really neat monster. If I had any complaint with it, it's that I'm not a big fan of the second iteration of Rodan when they kind of softened his image. And this is the point in the series when Godzilla's image would slowly kind of become softened and a little bit more kid-friendly as Godzilla becomes more of a hero. He's still a reluctant hero in this one. He's not quite the friend of humanity that he would become later. But Rodan in this movie, I think, suffers the most. The original Rodan is one of the most beautiful Japanese monsters ever. That face sculpt is just really stunning, well done work. And in this one, he's really goofy looking. He looks like a turkey. And that goes in line with them trying to soften Godzilla's image a little bit, which I can't complain about too much because when you have a series that goes on for 29 films, you have to, you have to change things up. You have to keep it fresh. But Ghidorah's really cool. I really like the build up to Ghidorah's egg hatching, his cocoon from space hatching. There's a weird science fiction plot about a princess who's reincarnated alien. So this is actually the first film in the series that kind of brings aliens into the mix too. But next up is Invasion of Astro Monster, aka Monster Zero, aka Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, aka Kaiju Daisensei, aka The Great Monster War. This is probably my favorite of all the Godzilla movies in the Showa era. Godzilla and the monsters aren't in it that much, but it has a really strong human cast and a really great, fun science fiction plot. I really like how goofy this movie gets without being completely ridiculous. The people of Planet X have these wonderful costumes. Think Devo. They have these cool visors, and I've always wanted to go to a convention and see a bunch of guys dressed as the people of Planet X because they have the greatest alien suits I've ever seen. Really cool theme by Akira Ifukube. It's a repurposed version of a Godzilla theme that appeared in the original Godzilla, but it since became the Monster Zero March, and I'm a big fan of it. I really like the camaraderie between astronaut Glenn and Fuji, which may have been a commentary on the changing American and Japanese relations at the time. I feel like this is the high point of the Japanese tokusatsu film. Japanese science fiction movie. It's about when they really started hitting their stride, around the time that show like Ultraman and Ultra Q came out. And this has those similar vibes to that. There's something just so incredibly special about Japanese science fiction films from this era. And one of the common complaints that people have about Godzilla movies, or whenever people, I'm going to spoil, I don't like the Legendary Pictures Godzilla movies, and one of the defenses that people have of those movies is, oh, the human characters don't matter. I completely disagree. There's some kind of fun characters in these original Godzilla movies, especially this one. Like I said, I really like astronaut Glenn and Fuji. Those characters are fun, and I really like Miss Namikawa and the aliens. I can't find a single character in the two legendary Godzilla movies that I like, let alone want to spend 2 hours with. And I'm going to go ahead and say this here. I don't like those movies. I don't think they're good movies. And all of the Godzilla fan service in the world cannot get me to like them. I just find them soulless. They just feel like boring studio product. And I know that's going to get a lot of hate, but I just don't like them. They're to me, a Godzilla movie will always come from Toho, and even the worst of the Toho movies still have a personality to them that I enjoy. Speaking of which, here I'm just shitting on two Godzilla movies that people like. I'm going to actually defend one that people hate, but I'm going to take a drink first. This is All Monsters Attack, aka Godzilla's Revenge. If you don't think of this as a Godzilla movie, and you just think of this as a children's fantasy movie, it's a lot of fun. It's silly. I get a good laugh out of it. A lot of it feels like Godzilla's greatest hits with all of the stock footage that's in it. I don't mind talking Minya. I find it so ridiculous that I can laugh at it, and I actually like the story of the little boy confronting his bullies and learning from monsters on how to confront bullies and stand up for himself. And he's just, and as a latchkey kid myself, I kind of identify with it, when you're just kind of left out to your own devices and you have to learn to, kind of live for yourself a little bit. And maybe grow up sooner than you have to. There's something cool about that with this movie. The other thing is, this movie's so psychedelic and weird that I can't hate it. I don't know. Again, if you just view it as this children's fantasy movie with clips from Godzilla movies in it and give it a chance, it's a lot of fun. And I don't think it deserves half the hate that it gets. Next up is, and I'm skipping Godzilla movies. Don't worry, I'll get to all of them. I'm just not doing them in order. Next up is The Terror of Mechagodzilla, the last film of the Showa era, and kind of trying to attempt to return to its former glory after a bunch of kiddier type movies, which I also like. But this one kind of has a little bit darker subject matter. The score by Akira Ifukube is one of his better ones. There's kind of this gothic feel to it. There's a Godzilla theme at the end that kind of bores down into my soul quite a bit. I really like the characters in this. I like the love story with the cyborg girl. I just think that's really neat. Yeah, this is a really cool one, and I actually like it more than Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. I just like that it's a lot darker. Next up is Rodan and War of the Gargantuas. Rodan I talked about a little bit before. Really beautiful movie and really beautiful monster suit. Probably the best designed of all of the Showa era monsters. Rodan is just stunning monster costume. The other thing I like about it is it's almost like two movies in one. You have the first half with these dragonfly, the Meganula or Meganulon. I can never remember which one because they do come back in a Godzilla movie. But you have the first half, which is like a horror movie with them, and then the second half it becomes this giant monster movie. And I always like the plot structure and the way it unfolds. The way that Rodan's hatching is almost a mystery. It's really cool. War of the Gargantuas is a really, really fun movie. It kind of started as a sequel to Frankenstein Conquers the World, but it's not really. Um, Sanda and Gyra, the fights between them are the best monster fights you'll ever see in these Showa movies because they can move really well in these humanoid suits. They could express a little bit more. Gyra, the Green Gargantua, is legitimately terrifying, and he used to scare the hell out of me as a kid. Um, so great. Next up is Son of Godzilla, which I'm not really into. I can watch it. I don't hate any of the Showa era Godzilla movies, but this is one that I don't particularly like. The Godzilla suit is ugly. Minya is annoying, and yes, I just praised Godzilla's Revenge, but I don't mind the talking Minya as much as this. I don't know. There's something about it. I do like the image of Minya and Godzilla in the snow at the end. It's kind of cute. Some of the score is really upbeat and fun, but I don't know. It's just never been one of my favorites. Next up is Godzilla versus Hedorah. I like that this one returns to kind of darker themes. There's this whole eco horror element to it. I often watch this movie paired with the movie Hausu because it's really psychedelic and weird. It's just there's no other Godzilla movie like this. It's just so surreal. I love the Save the Earth song. The opening reminds me of a James Bond opening, kind of with the sexy girl dancing with the colored lights and the song. It's very much like a James Bond opening, and I like it. But not one I go to a lot, but I do like it. This one is probably the Godzilla movie that I go to the least. I'm not a huge fan of Godzilla versus Gigan, or Gigan as a monster design. He's a little too out there for me. The weird like hippies in this movie, the cockroach people. Something about this movie feels cheap, and I know the next one, Megalon, is even cheaper. But there's something about this one with the Godzilla suit falling apart, and I'm just not a huge fan of it. It repurposes a lot of stuff, but I do like the idea of the Godzilla theme park with the Godzilla Tower. I find that visual really cool. Godzilla versus Megalon, or Godzilla versus Mecha Godzilla. This is a really cool one. It's a really groovy soundtrack. Mecha Godzilla, the original classic Mecha Godzilla, is like the best that they ever did with the character. It just made sense for Godzilla to have an evil doppelganger at this point in time. I never really liked Mecha Godzilla as a weapon of the Japanese military. I always thought that was kind of weird. Like, okay, you're really going to spend all this money making it look like Godzilla? Whereas this was like almost the Bizarro version. He is to Godzilla what Bizarro was to Superman, you know? So it kind of made sense that, oh, it's this evil Godzilla. It doesn't quite capitalize on Godzilla being framed up by Mecha Godzilla because Mecha Godzilla is pretty much revealed almost instantly after you see him. But it's a lot of fun, and I really like the Okinawan monster King Caesar. I like the King Caesar song. I know it goes on forever, but it's a lot of fun. It's almost more fun that it just keeps going and going. Um, Next, we're getting up in the Heisei series, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah and Godzilla vs. Mothra from the 90s. I'm going to be honest, I'm actually not really that into the Heisei series. I find that too many Hollywood aspects start to creep their way into them. You have a lot of Terminator references in this and a lot of Indiana Jones references in this. And I'm sorry, I really don't want references to Spielberg and Cameron in my foreign films. I watch foreign films to get away from American movies, so I don't really like that all that much. But there's some pretty cool stuff. Like I really like the time travel plot in this. The fact that you get to see the Heisei Godzilla's origin and bringing it back to World War II. It's kind of neat, but not my favorite. And this one I don't like at all, really. I'll just watch the original Godzilla versus Mothra. But they're not terrible, but they're just not my favorite. They don't bring anything new, really. Godzilla vs. Mecha Godzilla 2, again, Heisei series. This one's really beautiful, though. I really like the choral music in this. And it has a redone version of Baby Godzilla that I just find to be one of the most adorable things ever created on film. I really like the Baby Godzilla in this. Next up is Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, which is a Godzilla that I do hate. I don't like this one at all. I have only seen it twice. I might give it another whirl sometime down the road, but yeah, it just doesn't do anything for me. Godzilla vs. Destroya is really good, though. Again, it brings in too many American things. There are a lot of nods to Alien in it, and I don't like that, but I do like the idea of Godzilla dying, and there's some really emotional scenes in this. Godzilla's death scene makes me cry. It's friggin' bleak and really sad and hard to watch. But the burning Godzilla suit is awesome. I really like the glowing eyes. That's the thing about this Heisei Godzilla is I do really like the look of the Heisei Godzilla, even though I'm not as into some of the retooled versions of his foes in this, but the Heisei Godzilla himself is cool, and I really like that they make him more of an animal, where he's sympathetic. It's a different approach. Next up is the Rebirth of Mothra 1 and 2. I do need to get the Blu-ray set so I can see the third one. These are kind of fun fantasy children's movies, but the thing I do like about them is the twins. There's a third Mothra twin. Her name is Belvira, and she's very attractive, but she's dressed in black, so she's like the goth version of the Mothra twins, and she flies around on this adorable little dragon. And there are great battles where the Mothra twins are fighting in the living room, riding on this little Mothra, fighting their evil sister who's flying around on a dragon. So I like that stuff. Pretty cool. Next up, we're getting into the Millennium series, and again, I really don't like the Millennium series very much. They're kind of, I don't know, they feel a little bit soulless. Like Godzilla versus Megaguirus, it's just, I don't know, it's pretty typical Godzilla. It doesn't really add anything new. This one, on the other hand, Godzilla, Mothra, Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. This is a really, really cool revision of Godzilla. It was done by the guy who did the three Heisei era Gamera movies, which are some of the greatest monster movies ever made. This is a really beautiful movie, and I feel like he adds a lot of his own touches and sensibilities into this. So this one stands out in the Millennium series as one that really has a vision and is so different, and it brings back the whole like World War II element. Really weird but kind of neat revision to Godzilla, where he's actually the ghost of the Japanese war dead, and a lot of people don't like that. But I mean, when you're this far into the series, you have to do something new, and I felt like that was a pretty cool angle. I like the fact that Godzilla in this is just ruthless and horrifying, and he has these white eyes, and there's nothing likable about Godzilla in this movie. He's just scary, and these monsters really get a pummeling. The only complaint I would really have is it's kind of a shame that Toho kept bringing Mothra and Ghidorah back again and again instead of bringing back the less used monsters. And when I found out that Ghidorah, who's a good guy in this, which is weird, was supposed to be Varan, my heart sunk a little bit, because I really like Varan, and I really would have liked to have seen him again. But they did keep an homage to Varan. If you look at his head is modeled after Varan. So I think that's a neat little nod to the monster he should have been. But otherwise, it's a great Godzilla movie. It's one of my favorites. Next up is Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. I really like the character of the lady in the Japanese military who's trying to train to become Mechagodzilla's pilot. I really like that story, and whenever the story is focusing on that, I like it. But in a lot of ways, it just feels like a live-action anime, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just not what I tend to look for in my Godzilla movies. Speaking of anime, I did not like the 3 Japanese animated Godzilla movies. I thought they were terrible. Godzilla Tokyo SOS. This is a follow-up to the previous one. Feels more like a remake of Mothra or a sequel to Mothra, and all of those aspects are really interesting. Whenever Mothra is on the screen, I'm usually pretty happy, but the plot doesn't do that much for me. Okay. Next up, and I have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to start rushing. Next up is Godzilla Final Wars. This is another one I don't like. I don't hate any of these movies. There's just some that don't do it for me, or ones that I return to more than others. But Final Wars, I really tried with this one. I really tried to view this as less of a Godzilla movie and more of a love letter to 1960s tokusatsu films just in general. Because there are references to Atragon and Gorath and whatnot, but it falls under par for me. The human characters are unlikable, and again, there are too many references to American movies. I don't watch a Godzilla movie to see references to X-Men and The Matrix. I just don't want to see it in my Godzilla movie. One saving grace is Don Fry is in it. He's a fighter. He plays Captain Gordon, and I just find that character really funny. All right, I'm going to do one more. My battery's about to die. I'm going to do one more, and then I'll get into the non-Godzilla Toho films next time. But last one is King Kong versus Godzilla. And again, I'm not a huge fan of this one. I know it's a beloved film. These two monsters are really iconic, but it's kind of a double-edged sword for me. I feel like Toho really screwed Willis O'Brien a lot. They took his idea and they turned it into a Godzilla movie, and I'm not a big fan of the satire in this movie. It runs a little bit more goofy than I like from these early Showa films. The King Kong suit is ugly. The King Kong has no personality, and kind of seeing a beloved monster from a film that's as magical and beautiful as King Kong, and then seeing him repurposed as basically a guy in a bad gorilla suit, it just doesn't do much for me. I do like the more reptilian Godzilla suit. The score by Akira Ifukube in the Japanese version is really awesome and would be repurposed a lot. It's a fun one. I mean, I can't say not watch it because I mean it's a good time, but it's not one of my favorites, and I don't like it as much as everyone else does. So I hate to end it on a sour note. Again, these are just my opinions. If you don't like them, I'm sorry, but we all have different opinions, and I love this stuff. Like, I eat this stuff up. I'm a huge fan of these films, and of course I'm going to have ones I don't like or ones that I like more than others. I mean, when you like something, you could still be critical of it. Anyway, I'm going to sign off before my video dies, and then next time I'll get into the rest of my Toho science fiction and fantasy films, and then into the rest of my kaiju films, and then the rest of my monster movies. So I'll see you guys later.